I want him gone before the next course goes out. Effective immediately.
You're firing your executive chef in front of your own donors.
I'm gonna fire the person who thought this menu was suitable for my gala.
That menu is in your contract, and so is what happens if you break it.
Spare me the paperwork lecture and get out of my kitchen.
You'll wish you'd read that paperwork by tomorrow morning.
Diane turned her back on him and waved toward the exit doors, her voice sharp enough to carry across the ballroom. Isaiah removed his chef's coat slowly, folding it once before setting it on the counter. Guests lowered their forks, phones already lifted to capture the moment. Rosalind Kane had no idea she had just handed the fired chef the legal right to claim the gala's entire budget for himself. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The chandeliers over the Kensington Grand Ballroom threw hard white light across 200 round tables, each one dressed in cream linen and gold chargers, and the tall windows along the eastern wall let in the full weight of the afternoon sun. It was the kind of brightness that made everything visible, every face, every gesture, every flicker of tension between the man in the white coat and the woman in the crimson gown, standing 3 feet from him near the service doors. Rosalind Kane's voice cut through the low hum of conversation with the precision of someone who had never once worried about being overheard. "I want him gone before the next course goes out," she said, "effective immediately." Gabriel Hutton did not move. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his chef's coat still buttoned to the collar, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him well enough to see the tightening at his jaw. "You're firing your executive chef in front of your own donors," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I'm firing whoever thought this menu belonged at my gala. That menu is in your contract," Gabriel said, "and so is what happens if you break it." Rosalind's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Spare me the paperwork lecture and get out of my kitchen. You'll wish you'd read that paperwork by tomorrow morning." She turned her back on him and waved toward the exit doors, her voice sharp enough to carry across the ballroom. Gabriel removed his chef's coat slowly, folding it once before setting it on the stainless counter behind him. Nearby, guests lowered their forks. Phones rose, dozens of them, catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. Small glass rectangles held at chest height and above shoulders, all of them aimed at the same 2 people. Rosalind Kane had no idea she had just handed the fired chef the legal right to claim the gala's entire budget for himself. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The whispering started before Gabriel had even reached the folded coat's second crease. It moved through the room the way it always does at events like this, low and fast, table to table. A current running beneath the string quartet, still playing near the far wall, oblivious for another few seconds to what had just happened 20 feet away. Amara Chukwu stood frozen near the plating station, a tray of seared branzino balanced in her hands, her eyes moving between Gabriel's face and Rosalind's back. She had worked beside him for 3 years. She had never once seen him raise his voice in a kitchen, not during a fire drill, not during a walk-in freezer failure 2 Thanksgivings ago, not during the night a line cook quit mid-service on New Year's Eve. She was not about to see it now, and some part of her understood that this was exactly what made the moment so unbearable to watch. Gabriel finished folding the coat. He set it down with the same care a man might use setting down something breakable, though it was only fabric, and looked up at Rosalind's back rather than her face, since she had not bothered to give him her face at all. "You understand," he said, his voice still even, "that I'm not the one who's going to have a problem tomorrow." Rosalind did not turn around. "Get him out," she said to no one in particular, though Claire Bennett, standing at her elbow in pale blue silk, nodded quickly as if the instruction had been meant for her. Claire leaned toward one of the event staff near the doors, a young man in a black vest who looked as though he would rather have been anywhere else in the building. "Escort the chef out," she said, "quietly if you can manage it." There was nothing quiet left to manage. 200 people had already seen it, and at least 60 of them were recording it, the small red dots on their screens blinking steadily under the chandelier light. Victor Langley, the Foundation's board chairman, sat near the head table with his napkin still folded in his lap, untouched. He had watched the entire exchange from 12 feet away and said nothing. He told himself later that he had been too slow to process what was happening, that by the time he understood the shape of it, it was already finished. That was the story he would tell himself. It was not entirely true. Gabriel walked past the plating station without hurrying, and Amara set down the tray of branzino before it could tremble out of her hands. "Chef," she said quietly, "what do you want me to do?" "Finish the service," Gabriel said. "The dish is right. The people eating it deserve to eat it." He did not raise his voice. He did not look back at Rosalind Kane, who had already turned to accept a glass of champagne from a passing server, as though the interruption had cost her nothing more than a change of subject at dinner. A murmur rippled outward from the tables nearest the kitchen doors, spreading toward the back of the room, where the light from the tall windows fell brightest across the marble floor. An older woman in pearls leaned toward her husband and said something behind her hand. A man in a navy suit lowered his phone only long enough to whisper to the woman beside him before lifting it again. "Did she just fire the chef in the middle of service?" someone asked, not quite believing the words even as they left her mouth. "Over the food," someone else answered. "She said it was too ethnic." The phrase moved through the room faster than anything Rosalind had said all evening, faster than her welcome toast, faster than her introduction of the Foundation's new fundraising goal. It landed on ears that had already tasted the first course. A smoked corn and black-eyed pea soup finished with a citrus gremolata that half the room had quietly admired 10 minutes earlier. Now it sat differently in their memory, reframed by 4 words spoken by the woman who had hired the man who made it. Gabriel reached the edge of the kitchen pass and paused. He looked back once, not at Rosalind, but at the room itself, at the 200 faces turned partly toward him and partly toward their phone screens, capturing something they would replay for weeks. "This menu," he said, loud enough now to carry, though his tone never rose above the register he had used since the beginning, was built around dishes served in the neighborhoods this hospital serves. Every ingredient on that table has a name and a history. I stand behind every plate that left this kitchen tonight. Rosalind's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. Something flickered across her face. Gone before most of the room could name it, but Claire Bennett saw it, and so did Victor Langley. "That's lovely," Rosalind said coolly, setting the glass down on the nearest table without looking at it. "But this is my event, and I decide what represents it." "You decided that 2 years ago," Gabriel said, "when you signed the contract that put me in this kitchen." The room went completely silent. It was the kind of silence that says more than words. The string quartet finally stopping mid-phrase as the violinist noticed what everyone else already had, 200 guests suspended between the soup course and whatever was coming next, unsure whether to keep eating or keep watching. Rosalind's composure held, but only just. A thin line appeared at the corner of her mouth, something between irritation and the beginning of doubt, though she buried it quickly beneath the same cold certainty she had carried into the ballroom that afternoon. "You're done here, Mr. Hutton," she said. "I'll have someone finalize your paperwork in the morning." "You'll want to read it first," Gabriel said, "before you finalize anything." He turned and walked toward the service exit, past Amara, past the tray of branzino still cooling under the heat lamps, past 2 waiters who stepped aside without being asked. He did not slam a door. He did not raise a hand. He simply walked, his back straight, his pace unhurried, the picture of a man leaving a building rather than a man being thrown out of one. Behind him, the whispering resumed, louder now, threading through the tables in both directions. A woman near the dessert station was already typing something into her phone, her thumbs moving fast. A man near the bar leaned toward a friend and said the words that would end up circulating online within the hour. She just fired her own chef on camera, over African food, at a hospital gala. Rosalind Kane heard none of it, or chose not to. She smoothed the front of her gown, lifted her chin, and gestured for the next course to be brought out, as though the interruption had been nothing more than a minor delay in an otherwise flawless evening. She had no idea what she had just triggered. Somewhere beneath the linens and the gold chargers and the low murmur of 200 voices trying to decide what they had just witnessed, a clause sat waiting inside a contract she had never bothered to read closely. A clause that would turn her evening's small cruelty into something far larger and far more expensive than she could yet imagine. Gabriel Hutton walked out into the bright afternoon light spilling through the lobby windows, calm on the outside, his jaw tight, his hands steady at his sides. He did not look back. By morning, Rosalind Kane would understand exactly what she had done. Tonight, she still believed she had won. 6 weeks earlier, the Foundation's kitchen smelled of nothing but citrus and cold steel, the overhead fluorescents humming steady above stainless counters still slick from the morning washdown. Gabriel Hutton arrived at 5:40, as he always did, his white chef coat pressed and buttoned to the collar, his black trousers creased from the dry cleaner's hanger. He set his knife roll on the counter and unrolled it slowly, each blade catching the light in turn. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening to the building wake up around him. This was the part of the job no one saw, not the donors in their gowns, not the board members in their tailored suits, just the quiet hour before the noise began, when a kitchen still belonged to the people who ran it. Amara Chukwu came in 20 minutes later, her apron already tied, a legal pad tucked under one arm. She was 29, sharp-eyed, and had spent 3 years learning under Gabriel the way an apprentice learns under someone who still remembers what it felt like to be underestimated. "You're early," Gabriel said, without turning around. "You're earlier," Amara said. "You've been here since before the security guard changed shifts." He allowed himself a small smile, the kind that came and went quickly, and gestured toward a crate of Scotch bonnet peppers sitting on the counter beside a sack of dried hibiscus. "I want you to taste something before the walkthrough," he said. "Tell me if it needs more heat or more patience." Amara took a spoon, tasted, closed her eyes for a second longer than necessary. "It needs nothing," she said. "It's already right." "It's never already right," Gabriel said. "It's right until someone forgets why it matters." That was the kind of thing he said often, and Amara had learned not to treat it as a riddle but as instruction. The recipe on the stove was jollof rice reworked with smoked bone broth, a dish that traced back nearly 15 years to a woman named Elena Marsh, the chef who had trained Gabriel in a restaurant kitchen that no longer existed, who had died 4 years earlier and left behind a stack of handwritten recipe cards that Gabriel still kept in a tin box in his apartment. Every gala menu he built carried at least one dish that began on those cards, adjusted, refined but never erased of where it came from. "She'd have liked this one," Amara said quietly, nodding at the pot. "She'd have told me it needs more ginger," Gabriel said. "She always thought everything needed more ginger." They worked through the morning the way they always did, Gabriel moving between stations with the unhurried authority of a man who had done this hundreds of times, correcting a knife angle here, tasting a reduction there, never raising his voice because he never needed to. The kitchen staff respected him not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it, one gala at a time, one perfectly executed service at a time, across 11 years of cooking for the Foundation's biggest nights. He had built a reputation most executive chefs in the city would have envied, 4 James Beard nominations, a profile in a regional food magazine that Elena Marsh had clipped and mailed to him before she got sick, a standing relationship with the hospital foundation that went back further than most of the current board members' tenure, including Victor Langley, who had chaired the board for 6 years and had sat through every one of Gabriel's galas without once questioning the menu. Victor Langley was not a cruel man. He was more precisely a careful one, the kind of chairman who preferred consensus to confrontation, who let stronger personalities set the direction of a room while he nodded along from the head of the table. He liked Gabriel. He respected Gabriel. He would also, when the moment came, say nothing at all. And that silence would matter more than anyone expected. 2 years before this particular morning, Gabriel had sat across from the Foundation's previous events director in a conference room much like the one Rosalind Kane would later use to try to contain a crisis of her own making. That was the year he had almost walked away from the gala circuit entirely. The previous event, a smaller fundraiser for a rival hospital network, had ended with Gabriel receiving less than half his agreed fee after the host claimed the evening had run over budget, a budget she herself had approved. He'd absorbed the loss quietly, the way he'd absorbed a dozen slights before it, but something in him had hardened afterward. When the Foundation approached him the following year, he told them plainly that he would not sign another contract without protection built into it. "I want a clause," he told the Foundation's lawyer at the time, a soft-spoken man named Preston who had since retired. "If I'm removed from an event without documented cause once service has begun, the host or organizer assumes full financial liability for the event, not partial, full." Preston had raised an eyebrow but hadn't argued. "That's an unusual ask, Mr. Hutton." "It's an unusual industry," Gabriel had said, his voice even, his hands folded on the table. "I've been underpaid, dismissed, and blamed for things that weren't mine to fix. I'm not asking for anything unfair. I'm asking for the same protection any vendor with the leverage to demand it would already have." The Foundation had agreed, mostly because no one at the table imagined the clause would ever be triggered. Contracts like that were insurance policies people signed and forgot, the the kind of language lawyers included to look thorough rather than to be used. Preston had filed it, Victor Langley had signed off on it without much scrutiny, and for 2 years it sat untouched in a drawer, waiting. Rosalind Kane had never read it. She had never read most of what she signed. She'd taken over as the gala's host that year after her predecessor stepped down, a wealthy widow with a taste for visibility, and a donor list built more on her husband's old money than her own instincts for the foundation's mission. She was polished in the way expensive things are polished, and she had strong opinions about how a room should feel before she ever asked what a room was for. 3 weeks before the gala, she'd requested a menu preview. Standing in the same kitchen where Gabrielle now worked, her heels clicking against the tile in a way that made 2 line cooks glance up and then quickly look back down. Jollof rice, she'd said, reading from the printed menu card Gabrielle had handed her, her tone landing somewhere between confusion and distaste. Suya spiced short rib, hibiscus reduction. She looked up at him, her expression polite but unmistakably cool. This is very regional. It's West African inspired, Gabrielle said. Many of the dishes are adapted from recipes my mentor developed over 20 years of cooking in this city. They've been on this gala's menu for the last 3 years, with strong response from the guests. I'm sure it's lovely for certain crowds, Rosalind said, setting the card down without finishing it. But our donors this year skew a bit more traditional. I just want to make sure the room feels cohesive. Something in the word cohesive settled uneasily in the kitchen's quiet air, though Gabrielle gave no outward sign of noticing it. His hands stayed steady at his sides. His voice remained level. The menu reflects the community this hospital serves, he said. Nearly 40% of the patient population in the pediatric wing alone comes from West African and Caribbean immigrant families. The board approved this direction 2 galas ago, and it's been part of what's made the event distinct. Rosalind's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes did, brief and cold. We'll see, she said, in the tone of someone who had already decided and was simply waiting for the right moment to say so. That evening, over drinks with her closest ally on the planning committee, she brought it up again. Claire Bennett listened, swirling wine she wasn't drinking, nodding along the way she always did when Rosalind needed an audience rather than an opinion. It's not that it isn't well made, Rosalind said. I'm sure the man is talented, but this is a room full of people who write 6-figure checks because they feel comfortable, Claire, comfortable and familiar. I don't think ethnic tasting menu is the note we want to hit. You could always simplify it closer to the date, Claire said. Standard fare, something safer. I might, Rosalind said, setting her glass down with a small, decisive click. I really might. Neither of them mentioned the contract. Neither of them had read it closely enough to know it mattered. Victor Langley, informed only that there was some discussion about menu direction, said nothing at all, the way he always did when a strong personality took the lead, and the outcome didn't yet seem urgent enough to require his voice. Back in the kitchen, unaware of the conversation happening 2 floors above him, Gabrielle Hutton finished plating a test dish for Amara, wiped his hands on a clean towel, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The rice held its color. The broth had depth. Somewhere in it was Alina Marsh's ginger, exactly the amount she would have wanted. It's good, Amara said, tasting again. It's ready, Gabrielle said. Whatever happens between now and the gala, this dish is ready. He had no way of knowing yet how soon those words would be tested or how completely. The gala arrived on a Saturday in late October, the ballroom filling by 6 with the particular hum of old money settling into new chairs. Afternoon light still slanted through the tall windows when the first guests trickled in, catching on champagne flutes and the polished brass of the service doors. By the time the sun dropped low enough to gild the chandeliers overhead, 200 guests had taken their seats, and Gabrielle Hutton stood at the pass in a crisp white chef's coat, sleeves rolled to the forearm, reviewing the first course tickets one final time. Rosalind Kane moved through the room in a deep emerald gown, greeting donors with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime learning which smile belonged to which face. She had not mentioned the menu again since her conversation with Claire Bennett 3 days earlier. Gabrielle had taken her silence as resolution. He was wrong. At 6:40, servers began carrying out the first course. Small plates of jollof spiced arancini finished with a Scotch bonnet aioli, plated on black stone with a single microgreen leaf. It was a dish Alina Marsh had developed 9 years earlier, refined by Gabrielle over 3 galas until it moved cleanly across the palate, heat rising only after the 3rd bite, familiar and unfamiliar at once. At table 12, a woman in a navy gown lifted a piece to her mouth, chewed once, and set the rest down with a small, deliberate motion. At table 9, a man leaned toward his wife and murmured something behind his hand, his eyebrows drawn together in polite confusion. Nothing loud, nothing rude, just a ripple of hesitation moving table to table, the kind of quiet that Rosalind noticed before anyone else did, because she had been waiting for it. She crossed the room without hurrying, her heels silent on the carpet, and slipped through the service door into the kitchen's overhead fluorescent glare. The air back there smelled of seared meat and citrus, of controlled heat and 40 hands moving in rhythm. Gabriel looked up from the pass, wiping his palms on a towel tucked at his waist. "Ms. Kane," he said, "is everything all right in the room?" "That's what I came to ask you," Rosalind said. Her voice was pitched low, but there was an edge under it already, thin and sharpening. "Tables have sent plates back untouched. 3 more are picking at it like it's foreign to them." "It is foreign to some of them," Gabriel said evenly. "That was the intention. The menu introduces guests to dishes that reflect the hospital's actual patient community. It's the same course that received a standing ovation from this room 2 years ago." "2 years ago isn't tonight," Rosalind said. "Tonight, I have people who came here to feel good about writing checks. Mr. Hutton, not to be lectured through their entrails about diversity." Gabriel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only visible change in his composure. "No one is being lectured," he said. "They're being fed well. If the room needs a moment to adjust, the second course will settle that." "There isn't going to be time for the room to adjust," Rosalind said. "This is a fundraiser, not an education." Amara Chukwu, plating the second course 3 feet away, kept her eyes down on the tray in front of her, but her hands had gone still. She had worked beside Gabriel long enough to know the particular quiet that came over him when he was holding something back rather than not feeling it at all. "Ms. Kane," Gabriel said, his voice still level, "I understand you're concerned about the room's reaction. I'd ask you to trust the process we agreed on months ago. The board signed off on this direction. I'd rather not make changes mid-service that could compromise the integrity of the next 4 courses." "I'm not asking you to compromise anything," Rosalind said, her voice climbing half a register. "I'm telling you the room isn't responding well, and as the host of this event, that is my concern to manage." "Then let me manage the kitchen," Gabriel said, "and you manage the room." The words weren't sharp, they weren't raised, but something in their steadiness landed harder than a shout would have, and Rosalind's expression flickered, just for a moment, into something colder than distaste. "We'll discuss this after service," she said, and turned on her heel back toward the ballroom doors. Amara exhaled slowly once the door swung shut behind her. "She's not going to let this go," she said quietly. "No," Gabriel said, "she isn't." He turned back to the pass, checked the next round of tickets, and gave no further sign that anything unusual had occurred at all. But something about the exchange had settled into the kitchen like smoke that hadn't cleared, and the line cooks worked a little faster, a little quieter, the way people do when they sense a storm somewhere just outside the room. The third course went out at 7:15, a smoked catfish dish layered over a groundnut stew, garnished with plantain crisps that shattered cleanly under a fork. It was, by any professional measure, the strongest plate of the night. It was also the one that finally broke Rosalind's patience. She stood near the head table as it was served, watching Claire Bennett's own plate arrive, watching Claire's polite smile flatten as she cut a small piece and set her fork down without eating it. "Rosalind," Claire said under her breath as Rosalind passed, "people are talking." "I know," Rosalind said. "You need to do something before this becomes the story of the night instead of the hospital." Rosalind didn't answer. She was already moving toward the kitchen again, faster this time, her heels striking the floor with more weight than before. Several guests near the service doors noticed her expression change as she passed, the smile gone entirely now, replaced by something tighter and more determined. Inside the kitchen, the noise was constant, ticket printers, the clatter of pans, low instructions passed between line cooks. Gabriel stood at the pass, calling out timing for the 4th course when Rosalind pushed through the door hard enough that it swung against the wall. "Mr. Hutton," she said, and this time there was no attempt at composure in her voice at all. "I need to speak with you, now." Gabriel set down the plate he was inspecting and turned to face her fully. "Ms. Kane, we're mid-service. If this can wait 10 minutes, I can give you my full attention." "It cannot wait 10 minutes," Rosalind said, her voice rising enough that 2 servers near the door slowed their steps, glancing over. "I have donors at 3 separate tables asking me why they're being served food they don't recognize at a hospital gala. This is not what was discussed." "This is exactly what was discussed," Gabriel said, his voice remaining calm even as hers climbed. The menu was reviewed and approved by the board 8 weeks ago. I have the emails if you'd like to see them. I don't care what emails you have, Rosalind snapped. I care about the room right now, and the room is uncomfortable. With respect, Gabriel said, discomfort isn't the same as failure. Guests have been quiet before, during a new course, and come around by dessert. This has happened at 3 prior galas. This isn't 3 prior galas, Rosalind said. This is my gala, and I am telling you the direction isn't working. Amara had stopped what she was doing entirely now, standing near the walk-in with a tray balanced against her hip, watching the exchange with her breath held. Around the kitchen, other staff had slowed as well, the way people do when they sense something is about to break, without knowing yet what shape it will take. Ms. Kane, Gabriel said, his voice still even, though something in his jaw had tightened further, I'd ask you to trust the menu through the remaining courses. Changing direction now, mid-service, would create more disruption than the discomfort you're describing. I don't need your advice on how to run my own event, Rosalind said, her voice cracking sharply across the last word. You work for this foundation, Mr. Hutton, you do not run it. I'm aware of that, Gabriel said quietly. I've never suggested otherwise. Then start acting like it, Rosalind said. Her hands had come up slightly, a gesture that stopped just short of pointing at him. Because right now I have 200 people out there who came to support a children's hospital, and instead they're being served a lesson in African cuisine they didn't ask for. The words landed hard in the small space between them. Amara's mouth opened slightly as though she meant to speak, then closed again. A line cooked near the fryer stopped moving entirely. Gabriel didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. The dishes are named on every menu card at every table, he said. No one was misled about what they'd be served. That's not the point, Rosalind said, her voice louder now, carrying past the kitchen doors into the edge of the ballroom itself, where a server pushing through with an empty tray paused mid-stride. The point is that this room needs to feel like it belongs to the people in it, and right now it doesn't. The hospital belongs to the people it treats, Gabriel said. The menu reflects that. I'd ask you to consider that before making a decision you can't undo mid-service. Something in that sentence, calm as it was, seemed to strike Rosalind harder than anything he'd said all night. Her face flushed, a deep color rising up her neck, and her hand tightened around the stem of the wine glass she was still somehow holding. You don't get to lecture me about what this hospital needs, she said, her voice no longer low at all, carrying now with real force. I have raised more money for this foundation in one season than you've earned in your entire career. The kitchen had gone almost entirely silent, the only sound the low hum of the exhaust fans overhead and the distant murmur of the ballroom beyond the door, which had begun ever so slightly to notice that something was wrong. Gabriel Hutton looked at her, his hands steady at his sides, his voice, when it came, quiet enough that Amara had to lean in slightly to catch it. Ms. Kane, he said, I understand you're upset, but I'd ask you to think carefully about what you say next. Rosalind's eyes narrowed, the flush deepening across her cheeks, her composure slipping further with every passing second. I don't need to think about it, she said. I've already decided. Gabriel Hutton untied his apron before anyone told him to. The white cotton top he wore beneath his chef's coat was still crisp, the black trousers pressed sharp at the crease, and he folded the coat over his forearm with the same steady economy he used to plate a dish that had to be perfect the first time. 200 faces watched him do it. Not one of them said a word. Amara Chakwu reached him first. She didn't speak either, not right away. She simply placed a hand at his elbow, the way she might steady a tray coming out of a hot oven, and guided him through the swinging kitchen doors and past the line cooks who had stopped their work entirely, spoons frozen over pans that would burn if someone didn't turn the heat down soon. Nobody did. Nobody moved until the doors swung shut behind them. In the service hallway, away from the chandeliers and the tall windows still catching the last gold light of the afternoon, Gabriel stopped walking. He set the folded coat down on a stainless steel prep table. His hands, when he looked at them, were perfectly steady. That fact alone seemed to surprise him more than anything Rosalind Kane had said. Chef, Amara said quietly, I'm so sorry. It's all right, Gabriel said. It wasn't all right. Amara could see that in the tightness at his jaw, in the way his breath came slow and deliberate. Way a man breathes when he is working very hard not to let anyone see him breathe at all, but his voice remained calm, and so she didn't push. What happens now? She asked. Gabriel looked at her for a long moment. Now, he said, I make a phone call. He didn't explain further. He picked his coat back up, draped it over his arm again, and walked toward the loading dark exit, already reaching into his trouser pocket for his phone. Amara watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him, and understood without being told that whatever came next had already been decided, months or years before tonight. What none of the 200 guests still murmuring in that ballroom understood, and what Rosalind Kane herself had no idea of as she stood near the head table, accepting a glass of champagne from Claire Bennett with a look of grim satisfaction, was that Gabriel Hutton's contract with the Foundation contained a single clause, drafted 2 years earlier, that made his removal that night one of the most expensive decisions of her life. The clause was not long. It ran 9 sentences, buried on page 14 of a 31-page services agreement, filed under a section heading so unremarkable that most people who read it skimmed past without a second thought. It stated, in language a lawyer would call ironclad and a layperson would simply call fair, that the executive chef could not be removed from an event once service had begun unless the Foundation could document, in writing, a specific and material breach of professional conduct occurring during that service. Absent such documentation, any removal would constitute a breach of contract by the Foundation itself, triggering full forfeiture of the event's entire operating budget to the chef, payable within 30 days. Gabriel had insisted on that language after a different gala 3 years before this one, where a previous host had cut his fee by 40% 2 days before the event and dared him to walk away with 200 plates already prepped. He hadn't walked away that night. He had simply made sure it could never happen to him again, or if it did, that it would cost someone everything. Rosalind Kane had signed the renewal of that contract 11 weeks earlier without reading past the signature page. She had no idea that the man she'd just humiliated in front of every major donor in the city hadn't only lost his job that night. He had, without either of them fully realizing it yet, just come into possession of roughly $1.2 million. That evening, long after the last guests had drifted out of the ballroom still talking in hushed, electric tones about what they'd witnessed, Victor Langley sat alone in his office on the 4th floor of the Foundation's administrative building, the overhead lights humming faintly, and picked up his phone. "Sonia," he said when the call connected, "I need you to look at something tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." Sonia Kapoor was the Foundation's general counsel, a woman of 38 years, with 14 of them spent reviewing contracts most executives never bothered to read closely. She was at home when Victor called, a mug of tea cooling on the table beside her laptop, and something in his voice made her set the mug down entirely. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Rosalind fired the chef mid-service," Victor said. "In front of everyone, 200 guests, Sonia, phone's out. It's probably online already. Fired him for what?" There was a pause on the line, long enough that Sonia could hear him exhale. "She said the menu was inappropriate," Victor said finally. "That it wasn't right for the room." Sonia said nothing for a moment. She had met Gabriel Hutton exactly twice, both times in passing, and both times had come away with the impression of a man who did not waste words or make mistakes he could avoid. "Was there documented cause?" she asked. "Anything in writing before tonight? Complaints, warnings, performance issues?" "No," Victor said. "Nothing." "Then pull his contract," Sonia said. "Tonight. I want to see the termination provisions before the board hears about this from anyone else." She didn't tell him what she already suspected. She had reviewed hundreds of vendor agreements over her years with the Foundation, and she remembered, vaguely, a note from 2 years back about a chef's contract that had gone through an unusual number of revisions before signing. She hadn't handled that renewal herself. It had been fast-tracked under the previous council and rubber-stamped by a board more interested in securing Gabriel Hutton's continued involvement than in reading every clause he'd insisted on. She opened her laptop again, tea forgotten, and logged into the Foundation's document server. Meanwhile, 3 miles across the city, Gabriel Hutton sat in his car in the loading dock lot, engine off, phone pressed to his ear. The parking lot lights had come on, casting flat white pools across the asphalt, and somewhere behind him, the last of the catering vans were pulling away from the building he'd just walked out of for what everyone assumed was the last time. "It happened," he said into the phone. "Tonight, during service." There was a voice on the other end, low and unhurried, asking a question Gabriel answered with a single word. "Yes," he said. "Exactly like we discussed. No documented cause. No warning, she did it in front of the entire room." Another question. Gabriel's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of anything beneath the calm. "I want it handled correctly," he said. "Not quickly, correctly. I'm not interested in a settlement that makes this go away quietly. I want it on record. He listened for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dark windows of the building ahead of him, the ballroom's chandeliers still faintly visible through the tall glass, throwing gold light onto a floor that 30 minutes ago had held 200 people watching him be dismissed like a line cook caught stealing from the register. Tomorrow morning, Gabriel said, that works, I'll bring the folder. He ended the call without saying who it was to. He sat in the driver's seat a moment longer, hands resting on the wheel, and allowed himself, finally, alone in the dark, to close his eyes. Just for a second. Then he started the engine and drove home, the same steady speed he always drove, nothing in his posture suggesting a man whose evening had just been detonated in front of the city's wealthiest donors. Back in her apartment, Sonia Kapoor scrolled through page after page of the services agreement, her tea long since gone cold beside her. She found the fee structure. She found the cancellation terms. She found the standard indemnification language every vendor contract carried, boilerplate she could have recited from memory. Then she found page 14. She read the heading twice, termination and service continuity provisions. It was the kind of heading that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't drafted it deliberately to mean everything. She read the first sentence, then the second, her eyes moving faster now, her breath slowing to match the growing tightness in her chest. By the fourth sentence, her hand had gone still on the trackpad. By the seventh, she had stopped scrolling entirely and simply stared at the screen, rereading the same clause a third time as though she expected the words to rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. Sonia Kapoor sat back in her chair, the color draining slowly from her face, the apartment silent except for the faint hum of her laptop fan. She thought of Rosalind Kane standing at that podium tonight, champagne in hand, utterly unaware. She reached for her phone to call Victor Langley back. Her hand was not quite steady. Sonia Kapoor called Victor Langley at 11:42 that night, and he answered on the first ring, as if he had been sitting with the phone in his hand waiting for it to happen. Tell me you found something small, he said. I found page 14, she said. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Sonia thought the call had dropped. Then Victor Langley exhaled, slow and audible, the sound of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. Read it to me, he said. She read it to him twice, her voice flat and careful, the way lawyers read language they wished did not exist. When she finished, neither of them spoke for several seconds. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of her laptop fan and the distant sound of a siren somewhere out on the avenue, fading as it turned a corner. He negotiated this himself, Victor said finally. 2 years ago. I remember the meeting. I thought it was standard vendor language. I didn't read it closely because I trusted the man across the table. You should have read it closely, Sonia said, because the man across the table read it very closely indeed. Victor Langley told her to bring the contract to his office at 8 the next morning and to call Rosalind Kane before then, gently, and tell her they needed to speak before the foundation's phones started ringing. Sonia said she would try gently. She was not sure, hanging up, that gently was a setting Rosalind Kane's morning had any room for. Rosalind Kane woke at 7 with a headache she blamed on the champagne and a text message from Claire Bennett that read only, "Have you seen this?" followed by a link. She lay in bed for a moment, the morning light already pale and even through the sheer curtains of her bedroom, before she reached for her phone and tapped the link. It was a video, 19 seconds long, filmed from a table near the kitchen doors. Rosalind watched herself on the small screen, watched her own mouth move, heard her own voice say the words "too ethnic for this room" with a clarity she had not appreciated in the moment. The video had 11,000 views. It had been posted 9 hours earlier. She sat up fully now, her headache forgotten, and read the caption beneath it. Hospital gala host fires black executive chef mid-service over menu. The comments beneath the caption were not kind, and there were already several hundred of them. Rosalind's hands did not tremble, not yet. She told herself this was nothing, a bad angle, a clip stripped of context, the kind of thing that burned hot online for a day and vanished by the weekend. She dressed for her 9 o'clock meeting with the board in a cream blouse and tailored charcoal trousers, applied her makeup with the same unhurried precision she applied to every morning of her life, and told herself, in the mirror, that she had done nothing wrong. The call from Sonia Kapoor came at 7:51, while Rosalind was still deciding on earrings. "Rosalind, it's Sonia. I need 15 minutes of your time before the board meeting. It's important. Can it wait until 9? Rosalind asked, already distracted, holding one earring up to the mirror and then the other. "No," Sonia said. "It really can't. Something in the lawyer's voice made Rosalind pause with the earring still in her hand. She had known Sonia Kapoor for 3 years. Through 2 galas and 1 embarrassing tax audit the foundation had weathered together, and in all that time, she had never once heard the woman's voice carry that particular flatness, the sound of someone delivering news they had rehearsed on the drive over because they did not trust themselves to say it any other way the first time. "Fine," Rosalind said. "My office, 8:15. Victor Langley was already seated when Rosalind arrived, in the leather chair across from her desk instead of behind his own, which struck her as strange before she had any idea why it should. He wore a gray suit, and a navy tie knotted slightly too tight, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he had not slept the way a man who chaired a hospital foundation board should sleep the night before a 9 o'clock meeting. Sonia Kapoor stood near the window, a slim leather folder held against her chest, and did not sit at all. "Good morning," Rosalind said, setting her handbag on the desk with a firmness meant to signal that she was still, whatever this was, the one in control of the room. "I assume this is about the video. I've seen it. It's ugly, but it will pass. These things always pass." "This isn't about the video," Victor said. "Then what is it about?" Sonia Kapoor opened the folder and set a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of Rosalind. Turned so the text faced her. Rosalind looked down at it without picking it up. "It's about the contract Gabriel Hutton signed 2 years ago," Sonia said, "specifically page 14, termination and service continuity provisions." "I'm aware there's a contract," Rosalind said. "There's always a contract. What of it?" "Read the highlighted section," Sonia said. Rosalind picked up the paper with 2 fingers, the way a person picks up something they suspect might be dirty, and read the paragraph Sonia had marked in yellow. She read it once quickly, the way she read most things, skimming for the shape of an idea rather than its substance. She read it a second time more slowly, her lips pressing into a thinner line with each sentence. "This says," Rosalind said, "that if the executive chef is removed from an event without documented cause after service has begun, the foundation forfeits the entire event budget to him." "Yes," Sonia said, "that's absurd." "It's binding," Sonia said. "It was signed by the foundation's general counsel at the time, countersigned by the board chair at the time, and it has been in effect, unchanged, for every gala since, including last night's." Rosalind set the paper down and looked between the 2 of them, her composure still fully intact, still every inch the woman who had stood at that podium the night before and dismissed a man's career with a wave of her hand. "This is a formality," she said. "A boilerplate clause some junior associate slipped in years ago. No one reviews these things line by line. It doesn't mean what you're suggesting it means." "It means exactly what it says," Sonia said. "I've reviewed it 4 times since 11 o'clock last night. I've cross-referenced it against the original engagement letter. There's no ambiguity in the language. None." "Then it's unenforceable," Rosalind said. "Contracts get thrown out for being unreasonable all the time. This is punitive. No court would uphold a clause that transfers an entire event's budget to a member of the catering staff over a personnel decision." "He wasn't catering staff," Victor said quietly. "He was the executive chef, engaged under a services agreement he negotiated personally, with terms he insisted on after a previous event where he says he was underpaid and dismissed without notice. He built this clause specifically for a situation exactly like the one you created last night. The word landed in the room the way a dish lands on a hard floor, and for a moment nobody moved to pick up the pieces. "I didn't create anything," Rosalind said, and for the first time her voice rose half a register. "I made a hosting decision. That is within my authority as chair of this gala. I have final say over presentation, over guest experience, over the tone of the evening. If a member of the kitchen staff cannot accommodate reasonable adjustments to a menu, that is a staffing issue, not a breach of anything." "He wasn't asked to accommodate an adjustment," Sonia said. "He was terminated on the spot, in front of 200 guests, with no documentation, no warning, and no cause cited beyond your personal discomfort with the menu's cultural framing." "My discomfort," Rosalind repeated, her jaw tightening, a flush beginning to climb up her throat, "was on behalf of our donors. I was protecting the tone of an event that raises money for a children's hospital. That is not a breach of contract. That is judgment. That is what I was hired to exercise." "You weren't hired," Victor said. "You volunteered your time as gala chair. Gabriel Hutton was hired, under a signed contract, with a clause we are now legally obligated to honor." Rosalind's eyes moved from Victor to Sonia and back again, searching each of their faces for some sign that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. that somewhere in the next sentence someone would tell her the clause applied only to natural disasters or acts of terrorism or some other catastrophe far removed from a hosting decision made in good taste. Neither face gave her what she was looking for. "How much," Rosalind said finally, "are we talking about?" Sonia consulted a second page in her folder. The gala's total event budget, as approved by the board in March, was $412,000. That figure includes venue, catering, production, staffing, decor, printed materials, and the auction infrastructure. Under the clause, all of it is forfeit to Mr. Hutton, payable within 30 days of written notice, with interest accruing at prime plus 2% if payment is delayed beyond that window. Rosalind laughed, a short brittle sound with no warmth in it at all. $412,000, she said, to a chef, because I told him his menu wasn't right for the room. Because you removed him without cause during active service, Sonia said. The reason doesn't matter to the clause. Only the timing and the absence of documentation matter, and there is no documentation. There was no formal complaint filed against Mr. Hutton before last night. No performance review flagging concerns. No written notice given prior to his removal. There is nothing in his file but 11 years of positive evaluations and 2 letters of commendation from previous board chairs. Then someone should have documented something, Rosalind snapped. Someone should have flagged this. Why wasn't I told about this clause before I made a decision I had every right to make as gala chair? You were sent the full contract packet in April. Victor said, "It's in the email. I checked this morning." The room went silent, the kind of silence that says more than any raised voice could, and Rosalind stood very still behind her desk with the paper still in her hand, her knuckles whitening slightly around its edge. "I want to speak to the original attorney who drafted this," she said. "The one from 2 years ago. I want him on the phone right now confirming this is what it actually says. Because I am not accepting a $400,000 liability based on one afternoon's reading by Foundation counsel." "I can call him," Sonia said, "but I'm telling you now, he will confirm exactly what I've already told you. I spoke with him at 7 this morning. He remembers drafting it. He remembers Mr. Hutton insisting on the specific language after what happened to him at a prior event." "I don't care what you remember him saying," Rosalind said, her voice climbing further now, sharper at the edges. "I want him on the phone. I want to hear it from him directly, and I want my own attorney in this room before anyone in this foundation says one more word to me about liability." Victor Langley looked at Sonia, and something passed between them, a silent agreement that arguing further with Rosalind Kane in this state would accomplish nothing. Sonia picked up the phone on Rosalind's desk without asking permission and dialed the number from memory. The call connected. A man's voice answered, tired and unhurried, a man who had clearly been expecting the call and had already resigned himself to explaining the same thing twice in one morning. "This is Rosalind Kane," Rosalind said, snatching the receiver from Sonia's hand before it had fully reached her ear. "I'm told you drafted a clause in Gabriel Hutton's services contract that makes the foundation liable for the entire gala budget if he's removed during service. I need you to tell me that's not what it actually says." There was a pause on the line, and then the voice, calm and almost gentle in its clarity, began to speak. Rosalind's face, still composed when she picked up the receiver, began to change somewhere in the second minute of listening. Her jaw set. A free hand pressed flat against the desk, fingers spread, as if bracing against something. "So there's no ambiguity," Rosalind said into the phone, her voice tight. "None at all." A pause. "And you're telling me he specifically asked for this language 2 years ago, before any of this happened?" Another pause, longer this time. "Thank you," Rosalind said finally, and hung up without waiting for a response. She set the receiver down slowly, and for the first time since she had entered her own office that morning, her hands were not quite steady. "He confirmed it," she said, mostly to herself. "Every word of it." Julian Hargrove arrived at 9:40, 40 minutes late for the board meeting he had never actually been invited to, because Rosalind had called him at 8:50 in a voice her attorney had not heard from her in the 4 years he'd represented her family's various interests. A voice with a crack running through the middle of it that he associated with genuine fear rather than her usual performance of concern. He was a tall man in his early 50s, dressed in a navy suit with a crisp white shirt open at the collar, no tie, the look of a man who billed by the hour and had learned long ago that appearing rushed cost him credibility. He listened to the situation laid out by Sonia Kapoor in 12 efficient minutes, reviewed the contract page himself twice, and then set the paper down on the conference table with the flat finality of a man closing a door he had checked was locked. "It's ironclad," Julian said. "There has to be an angle," Rosalind said. "Something, a procedural defect, a statute we can invoke, something about the manner of his removal that gives us an opening." "There isn't," Julian said. "I've read contracts like this my entire career, Rosalind, and this one was drafted by someone who understood exactly what he was protecting himself against. The language is specific. It requires documented cause, and it defines documented cause narrowly, meaning a written warning, a formal complaint, or a performance review flagging the specific issue, filed and acknowledged before the removal takes place. None of that exists here. You made a decision in the moment, in front of witnesses, with no paper trail behind it. That's not a defense. That's a confession with an audience." "I was exercising judgment as gala chair," Rosalind said, the words coming faster now, sharper. "I have every right to determine the tone of an event I'm hosting." "You have the right to make hosting decisions," Julian said. "You do not have the right to unilaterally terminate a contracted vendor without triggering the exact clause he built specifically to prevent people like you from doing exactly what you did." He said it without raising his voice, without any particular heat. Way a man delivers a diagnosis he has delivered many times before and has stopped expecting anyone to enjoy hearing. Rosalind stood and walked to the window, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, staring out at morning that had turned bright and clear over the city, the kind of light that made everything below look ordinary and unbothered, entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. $412,000, she said, not turning around. "A man I've known for less than 3 months, because I told him his food didn't fit the room." "That's the number today," Sonia said quietly. "It could grow. If this becomes public in a way that damages the Foundation's fundraising capacity going forward, there may be additional liability arguments beyond the contract itself. Reputational harm, loss of future business relationships." "It's already public," Victor said, and everyone in the room turned to look at him. He held up his phone, the screen showing a headline that had gone up 40 minutes earlier on a food and hospitality trade site with a readership Rosalind had never bothered to learn the name of until this exact moment. "Gala host fires award-winning chef over menu, guest videos raise questions." "Who wrote that?" Rosalind said. "Desmond Foster," Victor said. "He covers restaurant and hospitality industry news. He's been following Gabriel Hutton's career for years. Profiled him after he won a regional award 4 years ago. Then someone needs to call him," Rosalind said. "Someone needs to explain to him that this is being blown wildly out of proportion, that this was a legitimate creative disagreement about menu direction, and that Mr. Hutton, frankly, overstepped his role. He is staff. He was hired to execute a vision, not dictate one. If he had a problem with adjustments to the menu, there were appropriate channels to raise that concern instead of turning a private staffing matter into a spectacle." Julian Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and something in his silence made the air in the room feel heavier than it had a moment before. "I would strongly advise against saying any version of that to a reporter," Julian said. "Why?" Rosalind said, turning from the window. "It's true. Because there are 11 separate videos circulating online right now," Julian said, "filmed by guests who paid $1,000 a plate to attend that gala, and in every one of them, you're the person raising your voice, and Mr. Hutton is the person standing perfectly still while you do it. Any statement painting him as the aggressor is going to collide directly with footage that shows the opposite. That's not a legal risk, Rosalind. That's a public relations catastrophe you'd be creating on top of the one you already have." Rosalind said nothing for a moment. Sonia Kapoor watched her carefully, studying her face the way a person studies whether they suspect is about to turn, and what she saw was not embarrassment, not yet regret, but something closer to disbelief, still fighting to hold its ground against the mounting evidence that the ground had already shifted beneath her. "Someone should have told me about this clause," Rosalind said again, quieter now, almost to herself. "In April, before the gala, someone should have flagged it." "Someone did," Victor said. "It was in the packet. Then someone should have flagged it more clearly." "It was on page 14, under a heading that says exactly what it means," Sonia said. "Termination and service continuity provisions. There isn't a clearer way to write it." The silence that followed was the kind that stretches, thin and taut, the kind that seems to press against the walls of a room until someone breaks it, and it was Julian Hargrove who finally did. "Here is what happens next," he said, addressing the room now rather than Rosalind alone, his voice even and procedural, the voice of a man laying out steps rather than opinions. "Mr. Hutton's team, whoever that turns out to be, will send formal written notice invoking the clause, likely within the next day or two, given how quickly this has already moved. Once that notice arrives, the Foundation has 30 days to remit the full amount or begin accruing interest. In the meantime, this story is already in the press, and it will only accelerate as more video surfaces. Anything said publicly between now and formal resolution needs to go through me first. Nothing spontaneous, nothing defensive, no interviews. I'm not hiding," Rosalind said. "I'm not asking you to." By that afternoon, Rosalind Kane had stopped asking whether the clause was real and started asking what could be done about the man who had written it. She sat at the head of a smaller table now, in a private dining room 2 floors below her own office, with Claire Bennett across from her and a pot of untouched coffee between them. Claire's blazer and slacks were pressed the way they always were, dark navy against pale skin, but her usual composure had thinned to something brittle. "We settle it," Claire said, quietly, "a number, an NDA, and it disappears before Foster gets a single quote he can use." Rosalind turned her cup slowly on its saucer without drinking from it. "Victor won't authorize a settlement without board approval. He's already hiding behind procedure. Then we go around Victor." Claire leaned forward. "You know how much of his re-election funding comes through my husband's foundation contacts. He owes both of us more than he's willing to admit out loud." Something in Rosalind's face shifted, not relief exactly, but the recognition of a lever she had not yet considered pulling. That evening, Victor Langley received a call from Claire Bennett that he did not mention to Sonia Kapoor until the following morning, and by then the plan had already taken shape, without either of them having voted on it. A modest settlement, quietly offered. A non-disclosure agreement attached to it, quietly worded. An understanding that Gabriel Hutton's silence could be purchased for less than the Foundation would lose if the clause played out in full. Victor called Gabriel personally to deliver the offer, choosing his words with the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 30 years avoiding direct blame for anything. "We'd like to resolve this without further disruption to the Foundation," he said. "A settlement. Generous under the circumstances, in exchange for your agreement not to discuss the events of that evening publicly." Gabriel listened without interrupting, standing in his kitchen at home with the phone against his ear and a knife resting on the cutting board beside a half-peeled onion. When Victor finished, Gabriel set the knife down entirely. "Generous," he repeated. "According to what figure?" "We haven't finalized the number, but it would be well above what most departing staff would." "I'm not most departing staff," Gabriel said. His voice remained calm, the same even register he had used at the podium 3 nights earlier, but something in the stillness of it carried more weight than volume could have. "I didn't leave. I was removed without cause during active service in front of 200 witnesses and several dozen phone cameras. That's not a negotiation, Victor. That's a documented breach." The line went quiet for a moment. "We're trying to find a path that works for everyone," Victor said finally. "Sounds like you're trying to find a path that works for Rosalind," Gabriel said, and hung up before Victor could answer. He stood in the kitchen a while longer, hands flat on the counter, breathing slowly. Then he picked the phone back up and called Sonia Kapoor. Sonia's office was smaller than Victor's, tucked at the end of a hallway lined with case files instead of art, and she had already pulled the original contract folder before Gabriel arrived. Amara Chukwu came with him. Still in her chef whites from the morning shift, her dark curls pulled back tight, sleeves rolled to the elbow. "They offered you money to disappear?" Amara said, disbelief sharpening her voice. "After what she did to you in front of everyone." "They offered me money to be quiet," Gabriel said. "There's a difference and it matters." Sonia slid a folder across the desk, thick with photocopies. "This is everything I could pull without a subpoena. The original signed contract. The amendment from 2 years ago, with your handwritten notes still in the margin, and email correspondence between Rosalind's office and the events team from 6 weeks ago." Gabriel opened the folder slowly, the way a man opens something he has been waiting a long time to see laid out in full. "Read the third email," Sonia said. Gabriel found it. A message from Rosalind to her assistant, dated 5 weeks before the gala. Subject line simply reading menu concerns. "Can we quietly transition to someone whose style fits the room better before this becomes an issue with donors?" The words sat on the page with no ambiguity left in them at all. She was planning this before she ever tasted a single dish. Amara said quietly. She was planning it before she ever met me, Gabriel said. Sonia closed the folder gently and folded her hands on top of it. This isn't just a wrongful termination anymore, Gabriel. This is premeditation. If this reaches counsel on the other side, it changes the entire conversation. It already has, Gabriel said. Victor called me this morning with a settlement offer and an NDA attached to it. Sonia's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened slightly. Did you sign anything? I didn't sign anything, Gabriel said. I didn't say anything either. I just told him he was trying to find a path that worked for Rosalind. The room went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that says more than words. While Gabriel sat with Sonia going through statements from 3 guests who had agreed, cautiously, to describe what they'd witnessed at the podium, Amara made her own quiet rounds through the kitchen staff who had been present that night. A line cook named Priya, still shaken by what she'd seen, agreed to write down exactly what she remembered hearing Rosalind say backstage before the firing. A server named Marcus, who had been standing near the kitchen doors, confirmed he'd heard Rosalind on the phone earlier that week telling someone the menu needed to go, and so did the chef. Each statement went into the same folder Sonia was building, page by page, until what had started as a single torn moment on a stage was becoming something closer to a paper trail with no gaps left in it. It was Amara who noticed the first sign that Rosalind and Claire were not simply defending themselves, but actively working to bury Gabriel's name elsewhere. A friend of hers, a chef at a downtown restaurant group, called to say a recruiter had reached out asking whether she'd heard anything about Gabriel Hutton being difficult on set, unprofessional with staff, prone to conflict with clients. The recruiter hadn't offered a source. Amara relayed the call to Gabriel that same evening. Standing in his apartment kitchen with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. They're not just trying to silence you, she said. They're trying to make sure nobody else hires you either. Gabriel's hands, resting on the counter, went still. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and when he finally spoke his voice was even quieter than before. Then we make sure the truth reaches further than the rumor does. 2 days later, Desmond Foster called him directly. Gabriel didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway, standing near the window of his apartment with the afternoon light falling flat and bright across the floor. Mr. Hutton, my name is Desmond Foster. I write for a hospitality trade publication, and I'm working on a story about what happened at the Ashgrove Gala. I was hoping you'd be willing to comment. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. What have you already confirmed? I have 3 separate guest recordings, a copy of the amended contract clause from a source I won't name, and a statement from someone inside the foundation confirming legal counsel is reviewing it, Foster said. What I don't have is you. Gabriel looked out the window, watching a bus pull away from the corner below, and considered how much silence had already cost him. I designed the menu around recipes from my mentor, Elena Marsh, he said finally. Every dish on that program was chosen to reflect the community the hospital actually serves. I was removed from active service without documented cause. Beyond that, I'll let the contract and the people who witnessed that night speak for themselves. It wasn't much. It was enough. That's more confirmation than anyone else on that guest list has given me, Foster said. Thank you. The call ended, and Gabriel stood by the window a while longer, his composure intact, but something in his chest finally beginning to loosen, the way a held breath loosens once it's clear it will not have to be held much longer. It was Sonia who found the last piece 3 nights later, buried in a routine cross-check of the Foundation's donor ledgers that had nothing to do with the gala at all. A recurring contribution, modest but consistent, from a holding company linked to Rosalind Kane's family trust, directed each year toward a political action fund that had, for the last 2 election cycles, financed Victor Langley's board re-election campaign. She stared at the spreadsheet for a long moment before picking up the phone to call Gabriel. He's not just protecting the foundation, she said, her voice tight with something that hadn't been there before. Victor's protecting the person who keeps him in his seat. The silence on Gabriel's end of the line stretched long enough that Sonia almost asked if he was still there. Then it isn't just her we're exposing, Gabriel said finally. It's the whole arrangement that let her believe she could do this in the first place. Before you continue watching, comment where you're watching Frost Folktales from tonight, and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's chapter brings this entire arrangement into the light in front of every donor and reporter in that room. The Ashgrove Foundation's main conference hall had never been used for anything like this before. Built for quarterly board meetings and the occasional donor luncheon, it seated 40 comfortably. By the time Sonia Kapoor arrived at 9 that morning, folding chairs lined the back wall 3 rows deep, and a cluster of press credentials caught the overhead light near the door. The room was bright in a way that made hiding difficult. Fluorescent panels overhead, joined by tall windows that let in the flat white light of clear morning. Every face in the room would be visible. That had been Sonia's request, and Victor Langley had not argued. Gabriel Hutton sat near the front, dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, his hands folded on the table before him. He had not worn his chef's coat. He would not need it today. Amara Chakwu sat beside him, her posture straight, her eyes moving across the gathering donors with the alertness of someone who had waited a long time for this morning to arrive. Desmond Foster took a seat in the second row, notebook already open, a small recorder placed on the table in front of him without apology. 2 other reporters flanked him, one from a local network, one from a health industry newsletter that rarely covered anything outside budget reports. Today was different, and everyone in the room seemed to understand it. Rosalind Kane arrived 11 minutes late, Julian Hargrove a step behind her, his expression carefully arranged into something between concern and control. She wore a cream blouse and tailored black slacks, her posture straight, her chin lifted in the manner of someone who still believed composure could be manufactured through will alone. She took her seat across the aisle from Gabriel without looking at him. Victor Langley called the meeting to order at 9:15. His voice, usually smooth in these settings, carried a rasp that suggested he had not slept. This session has been called to address concerns raised following the Ashgrove Gala, he said. The Foundation takes these concerns seriously. We've asked our legal counsel, Sonia Kapoor, to walk us through the relevant contract terms. Sonia stood, a slim folder in hand, and did not need notes for what came next. 2 years ago, the Foundation entered into a service agreement with Gabriel Hutton for executive culinary direction of its annual gala, she said, her voice even, carrying clearly across the room. Section 14, subsection 2, states that removal of the executive chef without documented cause after service has commenced constitutes an immediate breach, triggering full forfeiture of the event's operating budget to the contracted chef. She paused, letting the words settle in the silent room. That budget for this year's gala was $412,000. The removal occurred at 8:47 p.m., 23 minutes after the first course had been served. There was no documented cause on file. There has never been one filed. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Someone near the back exhaled audibly. A donor in the third row lowered her water glass without drinking from it. Rosalind's hand tightened around the edge of the table. That clause was never meant to apply to a simple staffing decision, she said, her voice rising slightly. I was the host of that event. I had every right to make decisions about who represented it. The contract doesn't distinguish between a simple staffing decision and any other kind, Sonia said. It distinguishes between documented cause and none. There was none. Julian Hargrove leaned toward Rosalind and murmured something. She waved him off. This is absurd, said. I'm being treated like a criminal for having an opinion about a menu. You're not being treated like a criminal, Victor said quietly. You're being asked to account for a decision that has cost this foundation its credibility and very possibly its budget. Gabriel had not yet spoken. He sat with his hands still folded, his eyes moving from Sonia to Rosalind to the rows of donors behind them, his face giving away nothing beyond a stillness that had, over the last several weeks, become its own kind of statement. When Victor finally turned to him and asked if he wanted to address the room, Gabriel rose slowly, buttoned his blazer, and stood without notes of his own. I didn't come here today to talk about money, he said, his voice calm, carrying without effort to the back row. I came to talk about why that menu existed in the first place. The room went completely silent. Every dish on that program came from recipes developed by my mentor, Elena Marsh, Gabriel said. She spent 31 years cooking in community kitchens on the West Side, feeding families who came through this hospital's doors long before any of you were writing checks for its gala. When she passed, she left me those recipes, and I built that menu to honor the patients this hospital actually serves, not the ones who happen to be in this room tonight. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. I was removed from that kitchen in front of 200 guests, called unprofessional, and told my work was too ethnic for this room. I didn't argue. I took off my coat and I left because I understood something Ms. Kane apparently didn't. This was never just a menu. It was a promise to the people this foundation exists to serve. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. Rosalind's composure was slipping, the flush of heat visible now along her neck. "You're twisting what happened," she snapped. "I never said the food itself was the problem. I said it wasn't appropriate for our donor base." "That's the same sentence," Amara said quietly from beside Gabriel, loud enough to carry. A ripple of murmurs passed through the donors. Someone toward the back lifted a phone to record. Sonia opened her folder again. "MS. Kane, I'd like to read something into the record," she said. A text message sent to Claire Bennett at 8:41 p.m., the night of the gala, 6 minutes before Mr. Hutton was removed from active service. Rosalind's face went pale. "That's private correspondence. It was submitted voluntarily as part of the review," Sonia said, and read aloud without emotion. "I don't care what it costs us to fix this. Get him out before the next course goes out. This isn't the gala I'm putting my name on." The words hung in the air like something that had been dropped and could not be picked back up. "You made the decision before service even reached its second course," Sonia said. "Not because of any failure in execution, because of how the menu made you feel in front of people you wanted to impress." Rosalind stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This entire meeting is a setup," she said, her voice cracking. "You've all decided the outcome before I've even had a chance to explain myself." "You've had several chances," Victor said, and something in his tone had shifted, tired now rather than defensive. "You've used them to explain why you were right, not what actually happened." The accusation hung in the air, and for the first time, Victor Langley looked directly at the donors seated behind him rather than at Rosalind. "I owe this room an account of my own," he said. "I was aware of concerns about this contract clause the night it happened. I chose not to act on them immediately, in part because MS. Kane's Family Foundation has supported this board's leadership for several election cycles, including my own. That should never have factored into how quickly we addressed a legitimate breach. It did. That failure is mine, and I'm accountable for it." A chill went through the room. Desmond Foster's pen moved quickly across his notebook, his eyes never leaving Victor's face. Rosalind turned toward Julian Hargrove, searching his face for something that might rescue the moment. But he had gone quiet, his own composure thin now, aware that whatever containment strategy he'd arrived with had already collapsed. "Julian," she said, her voice thin, "tell them the clause doesn't apply the way she's describing it." "It applies exactly the way she's describing it," Julian said quietly. "I confirmed the language myself 3 days ago." The silence that followed was the kind that says more than words. Rosalind looked around the room. At the donors who had once applauded her invitations, at the reporters recording every second of her unraveling, and for a moment, her mouth opened without anything coming out. "I built that gala," she finally said, her voice small now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "I raised more money for this foundation than anyone in the last 5 years. "You did," Victor said, "and tonight you cost it $412,000 and its reputation over a menu built to honor the community this hospital exists to serve." The board chairman looked toward the donors, then back at Rosalind. "Effective immediately, MS. Kane is relieved of her hosting title and any future role with this foundation," he said. "The board will issue a full public apology to Mr. Hutton, along with immediate settlement per the terms of his contract." Rosalind said nothing. She stood there a moment longer, the weight of every eye in the room fixed on her, before gathering her things with hands that trembled slightly and walking out without another word, Julian Hargrove following a step behind. His silence its own kind of resignation. Gabriel remained seated, his eyes never leaving the door until it closed. He did not smile. He did not look satisfied in the way people expect satisfaction to look. He simply exhaled slowly, the breath of a man who had spent weeks carrying something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. Amara reached over and rested her hand briefly on his arm. Neither of them said anything. The silence between them was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Desmond Foster caught Gabriel's eye from across the room and gave a small nod, the kind exchanged between two people who both understood that the story, at last, would be told the way it actually happened. Settlement arrived 19 days later, wired in full, $412,000 deposited into an account the foundation's own counsel had helped Gabriel set up. Sonia Kapoor called him personally to confirm the transfer, her voice carrying none of the formality she'd used in their first conversations weeks earlier. "It's done," she said, "every dollar per the original terms." Gabriel stood in his kitchen when he took the call, a cutting board in front of him, a knife resting flat against a pile of Scotch bonnet peppers he hadn't yet touched. He thanked her quietly and set the phone down on the counter. He did not celebrate. He picked the knife back up and kept working, the way he had every morning of his career, because that was what steady hands did with news, good or bad. Desmond Foster's article ran 3 days after the board meeting, above the fold in the paper's food section, and syndicated within hours to 4 national outlets. The headline was simple, almost restrained compared to what it could have been. Asterisk the chef they tried to erase. Asterisk inside, Desmond wrote plainly about the menu, about Elena Marsh, about the decades she'd spent cooking in church basements and community centers before anyone with money thought to call her cuisine sophisticated. He wrote about the clause, the exact language, the $412,000 figure, and the 11 minutes between the first course being served and Gabriel being asked to remove his coat in front of 200 guests. He did not editorialize. He didn't need to. The facts, laid end to end, did the work themselves. Amara read the article aloud in the kitchen the morning it published, her voice catching once near the end, at the paragraph describing Elena Marsh's handwritten recipe cards, the ones Gabriel still kept in a metal box on his shelf at home. They spelled her name right, Amara said, something thick in her throat. 3 E's in the old profile they ran when she passed. This one has it right. Gabriel nodded, said nothing for a moment, then went back to plating. That was how most of the good news reached him in those weeks, delivered mid-task, absorbed without ceremony, folded into the rhythm of a man who had never needed applause to know the value of his own work. He had spent his whole career being told, in small ways and large ones, that what he made needed translating for rooms that weren't ready for it. The article didn't change who he was. It only made it harder for anyone else to pretend they hadn't seen it clearly. Rosalind Kane's name appeared nowhere on any gala committee that season or the one after. The Foundation's spring newsletter, usually thick with photographs of her in designer gowns beside oversized checks, ran no mention of her at all. Word moved through the circles she'd once commanded the way word always moves through such circles, quietly, at luncheons and charity previews, in the careful non-invitations that said more than any public statement could. Claire Bennett distanced herself within a month, telling anyone who asked that she'd always found the whole situation troubling, a version of events that fooled no one who had actually been in the ballroom that night. Rosalind did not attend a single Foundation event again. She did not need to be told twice that the doors that had once opened for her name now simply didn't. Victor Langley did what men in his position often do only after the cost of not doing it becomes impossible to ignore. He restructured the board's oversight committee within 6 weeks, adding 2 independent seats specifically tasked with reviewing vendor and staff contracts before major events, and he made Sonia Kapoor's office a permanent point of review rather than an afterthought consulted only when something had already gone wrong. He gave one more public statement, brief and without theatrics, acknowledging that the Foundation's failure had not been a single night's mistake, but a pattern of deference that had allowed one night to happen. It was not an apology dressed up as anything grander. It was accountability, offered plainly, the kind Gabriel recognized as sincere because it asked for nothing in return. Gabriel took none of it personally in the sense of vengeance satisfied. What he felt, in the weeks that followed, was something closer to relief settling into permanence, the kind that comes when a debt long carried has finally been paid in full and there is nothing left to brace against. He used $60,000 of the settlement to open the Elena Marsh Community Kitchen, a modest space 3 blocks from the hospital, in a storefront that had once been a shuttered laundromat. Amara became his partner in it before he'd even finished drafting the proposal, quitting her position at the Foundation's catering arm within the same week to help build out the program full-time. The kitchen would run free cooking classes for teenagers from the hospital's surrounding neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods Elena Marsh had spent 30 years feeding without ever once being asked to soften what she made for anyone's comfort. 6 scholarship slots would send promising students each year into culinary training programs Gabriel had once needed and never had. The night before the kitchen opened its doors, Gabriel stood alone in the half-finished space, folding chairs stacked against one wall, the smell of fresh paint still heavy in the air. Amara found him there just after 7, a box of Elena's recipe cards under her arm. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, setting the box down on the nearest counter. "The money would have been enough on its own. Nobody would have blamed you for keeping it. It was never just money." Gabriel said, His voice remained even, though something in his jaw softened as he said it. She fed people who nobody else would feed, for free for years, and nobody ever put her name on anything. This puts her name on something that outlasts both of us. Amara didn't answer right away. She opened the box instead, lifted out the top card, worn soft at the corners, Alina's handwriting slanted and confident across the front. A recipe for jollof rice, annotated in the margins with substitutions for whatever was cheapest that particular week, decades of quiet improvisation compressed into a single index card. She would have liked this place, Amara said finally. She would have told me the paint color was wrong, Gabriel said, and something close to a smile crossed his face, the first either of them had seen in weeks. The opening itself was small, deliberately so. No press releases, no donor list, no photographers waiting outside for a moment to capture. Desmond Foster came anyway, notebook tucked into his jacket pocket rather than out and working, there as something closer to a friend than a reporter. He stood near the back during the ribbon cutting, watching Gabriel address the dozen teenagers who'd signed up for the first cohort, watching him hand each of them an apron folded the way Alina used to fold his, corners tucked precisely, nothing left loose. Cooking is the one language nobody can take from you once you've learned it, Gabriel told them, his voice carrying clearly across the small room without needing to be raised. Learn it well enough, and no one gets to decide what your food is worth but you. There was no dramatic flourish to the moment. No one clapped for longer than they needed to. It was simply true, spoken plainly. And it settled into the room the way truth tends to when it doesn't need decoration to be believed. 3 months later, the hospital's board asked Gabriel to return as executive chef for the following year's gala, this time with full menu authority written explicitly into the contract, along with language that made clear no host, honorary or otherwise, held authority over kitchen staffing during active service. Victor Langley delivered the offer personally, sitting across from Gabriel in the same conference room where Sonia Kapoor had once read a contract clause allowed to a room full of frightened executives. "We'd understand if you said no," Victor said. "After everything." Gabriel considered it for a long moment, the offer, the room, the year behind him. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but the menu carries Alina's name on the program this time, not as an inspiration note in small print, her name printed the same size as mine." Victor agreed without hesitation. It was, by then, the smallest thing the foundation could offer. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon that spring, sunlight fell through the tall windows of the community kitchen in wide, clean bars across the stainless counters, catching the steam rising off a pot Gabriel stirred slowly near the back wall. Amara moved beside him, teaching 2 of the scholarship students how to properly break down a chicken, her voice patient in a way that echoed his own. The room smelled of ginger and simmering stock, the low hum of conversation threading between 3 separate stations where teenagers who had never held a chef's knife before were learning, carefully, how to hold one now. Gabriel tasted the sauce from the edge of a wooden spoon, adjusted the seasoning with a small, unhurried motion, and set the spoon down. He did not think, in that moment, of Rosalind Kane's face the night the board stripped her of everything she'd built her name on. He did not think of the torn contract copies, the whispered accusations in front of 200 guests, the 11 minutes it took for a woman with more money than judgment to decide his food wasn't worthy of her room. Those things belonged to a version of his life that had already closed, the way a pot lid settles once the steam inside has finally been allowed to escape. What he thought of instead was Alina, decades ago, handing him his first apron in a church basement kitchen, not unlike this one, telling him that the proof of good cooking was never in the applause. It was in whether the same people came back hungry the next week, trusting that what waited for them would still be exactly as good. He looked around the kitchen once more, at Amara's steady hands guiding a nervous 15-year-old through a task she'd once needed guiding through herself, at the recipe cards pinned along the wall in Alina's unmistakable handwriting, at the light pouring clean and bright across a room built entirely on the idea that no one gets to tell you your culture isn't worth the table it's served on. He turned back to the pot, lowered the heat slightly, and kept working. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.